Hey guys, I am Kristen Howerton. I blog at Rage Against the Minivan, and I am here with Leslie Dixon, who is the founder and chief educator at Birds and Bees Connection, which is dedicated to teaching young kids and their families how to talk about sex in a healthy way. So we have been doing this ongoing conversation about talking to your kids about sex, and we have kind of gone developmentally and incrementally. We are hovering around the middle school, high school years, so we're going to try to wrap that up today. But one of the questions that somebody had last week that I thought was really relevant to this age group was, how do you talk to kids about birth control? How do you explain all of it to them? And how do you even make it accessible to them without feeling like you've just given your child a license to drive in terms of sex? So how do you balance that, maybe desire for your child to delay sexuality, delay sexual behavior, but at the same time shoring up that if they maybe don't follow your advice or desire in that area, that they are protected and safe if they choose to engage in sex?
And you just summed everything up so beautifully. Thank you. It's a really important topic. I mean, part of this conversation we've been having is all these conversations about all these topics. And I think one of the biggest concerns parents have is, if I sit down and have these conversations with my children, it is open invitation for them to go out and have sex. Yeah. If I teach them, and it's been a conversation even in schools, is that if they teach this, then, then they can go out and have sex. And the research, when we saw that during the time that it was abstinence only, when we weren't teaching anything, and it was more fear-based, that what happened was then they still had sex. Right. They weren't prepared. Right. And that's when all our statistics went, right through the roof. So the
in terms of teen pregnancy.
Absolute, STDs, everything, because they weren't prepared. Now, this being said, we are not giving them permission. In fact, I think all these conversations are about, we want those young people to postpone. And I think it's a very holistic approach to this conversation. It's understanding how amazing their bodies are and how precious we want them to stay, and that and when you engage in early sexual involvement, you are putting your bodies at risk. And I always say, one of the first things I ask parents to do is, you know what? I love you, and that's why I'm having this conversation. I'm concerned for you. So it's for me and for you that I want to have the conversation about, we're going to talk about birth control, we're going to talk about prevention, and what's the risks here. And I want you to know that I, as a parent, feel it's important to educate you, because I think that empowers you. And this is not my permission for you now with this information to become sexually active. What this is opening up the door for us to have these open conversations, for you, if you have any questions, to be able to know that you can come to me, because I want to help you as you navigate through these teen years with questions and concerns, and the fact that your body sort of, again, we've talked about this, is sort of hardwired to have these feelings, and what you can do about it.
Right. Okay, so hypothetical, and this is purely hypothetical because my kids are still under this developmentally, but
sure.
Let's say I have that conversation with my daughter. You can come talk to me, open communication, and at 15 she comes to me and says, okay, well, I want to go on birth control. Then what?
Well, I think, that's always the concern. And at some point, you have to have the conversation of, not only you've had the conversation about birth control, but what is this relationship all about? So what is your relationship with this person? What are the conversations you had with this person? And I think here's one of the challenges with parents is you have a choice. You can either be in denial and they'll go out and do it anyway, or you can have this conversation and they can come to you and at least they open the door where, yes, in the long run they may go and do it. I mean, they reach a certain point and that's a possibility. On the other hand, if you have this open conversation, comfort with your child, there is a pretty good chance that, you know, they can postpone when you have this non-judgmental, fear-based,
Right.
shaming, fear-based conversation like,
Right.
are you going to do it? Have you
Right.
done it? You know,
But more of a rational
yes,
conversation.
rational conversation,
Yeah.
and an open conversation where you're asking questions.
Yeah.
All right, so I hear what you're saying. You want birth control. Let's talk about it a little bit. Are you willing to have this conversation? I am.
Yeah.
And we've already opened the door. I know we've opened the door with this. And so let's have a conversation about this relationship with the person that you're seeing. How long has it gone on for? What conversation have you had with that person? Have you talked about your sexual history? You know, if you haven't engaged in sex, well, that's one thing. Has that person? Do you trust him? There's something that I do in one of my classes, and the reason I bring this up is because developmentally. So I think teenagers, we have this activity called the relationship pyramid, and it's breaking down the three major issues of relationships, one being physical, social, and emotional. We know teens have the social down, physical down. It's the emotional because their brains aren't mature enough.
Right.
So part of this conversation is helping them to understand how to make certain decisions, consequences, without being judgmental or shaming, and letting them start to think about it.
Yeah.
And even to the point of, let's have this conversation. Let's even sort of put this aside for now. Don't make any decisions. I want you to think about it, and let's continue this conversation before you make any decisions. And it may sound a little pie in the sky. I understand it. Again, what's the choice? More than likely, if you don't have these conversations with your children, they're going to go and do it anyway.
Right.
They can go to a clinic and get birth control all on their own. They don't need your, permission.
Right.
So
They don't, but I think where parents, have to be realistic is they may not. They may not go to the clinic. They may not go to the drugstore and buy and buy a condom. So if we are serious,
true,
about teaching our kids about birth control,
right.
I think a part of that is making it accessible and easy to obtain for them, which means removing any obstacles that our children have in terms of obtaining birth control. And I say this as someone whose family in many generations has been affected by early pregnancy.
Right.
And so that for me is a big one of those condoms. That birth control needs to be, if my kid wants it, while I would probably not be super thrilled about it, I feel like I'm going to get it in front of them and take away any obstacles to them obtaining it, regardless of my own values on sexuality, because they may not share my values.
And I really agree and respect, and I hope that parents that are listening to this are willing to look at it in that way, is that this education is real important, and that if we aren't willing to help them with this topic, yes, they're going to do it without anything, and more than likely they'll engage in sex, and they may not use anything, and then we have the possibilities of early pregnancy or STDs, and that's the biggest concern that we're having now, is without any education at all, they are having these challenges. Now, we have seen the increase of teenagers, girls being on birth control, with the pregnancy rate go down, but the STD rate, going up. And so it's not just about birth control. It really is about the whole breadth of this conversation and the willingness to listen and the willingness to, at some point, saying, okay, this is something you want to do. I would rather you have the education, the knowledge, and are you willing? Can we go together? And have that experience, because I think that's healthy.
Yeah. I was listening to a really fascinating TED Talk by Peggy Orenstein last night, and she wrote a fantastic book called Girls and Sex. If you have girls, you need to read it, and you will be mortified, but you should read it. Because it is, wow, eye-opening. But, you know, research is really showing that girls are engaging in sexual behavior earlier and earlier.
Yes.
I mean, we've talked about this over and over. They're engaging in sexual acts outside of intercourse, very casually, thinking it's not sex. But one of the things she talked about in terms of talking to young girls is putting forward values around who they engage in any sexual behavior with.
Right.
And she suggested redefining the way we look at virginity and sexuality, and that really, you know, sex with another person is climaxing with another person.
Right.
Is, you know, and engaging it that way so that we don't send our kids out thinking like anything I do that isn't penetration, you know, vaginal penetration is not sex.
Right.
But she talked about kind of instilling the values in our kids of that sex should be reciprocal.
Yeah.
It should be respectful.
Yes.
It should be intimate.
Yes.
And it should be trusting.
Yes.
And I think that's an interesting thing to present to kids because I know, you know, I come from a religious background. I still hold, you know, some of those values, but that doesn't always translate to our kids.
Correct.
And while I think it's important if you hold those religious values to try to impart those to your kids, it's also important for them to understand that delaying sexuality is not just about religion. So if they decide, you know what, I'm not really down with my parents' religion, they aren't going, so then I do anything sexually that I want.
Right.
That this is not just about religion. It's also about self-respect. It's also about culture. It's, you know, it's about all of these aspects of ourselves.
And so this is part of the conversation. It isn't just about birth control. It isn't just about STDs.
Right.
It's about values. It's about relationships. And I think, you know, whether it be for girls or for boys, but I think especially, well, I think for either, you know, having this conversation is if you engage in sex, what is the potential emotional outcome as well? They're motivated. This is an immature brain. They're motivated from these, you know, hormones that are sort of, you know, getting them all riled up sexually and not necessarily thinking of what the emotional outcome is as well. And for many girls, there is, and I know Peggy talks about this in her book, is that the emotional letdown after this happens because they're not properly prepared.
Absolutely.
They've not had this whole conversation. It's like slam bam, you know, it just happens and there's this sort of letdown. And what the problem with that is, it doesn't affect them just now. It affects them for the rest of their life. And oftentimes in how they view themselves sexually and relationship-wise. And one of the things I say to teenagers is, especially to girls, is know your body physically. Is that if you're not comfortable with your body, if you haven't explored it and masturbated and feel comfortable with your body, and I know this is a challenging topic, are you ready to have somebody else, you know, have sex with you, touch you? And what kind of language empowerment talk are you going to be able to verbalize to that person? So what kind of experience is really going to be? And that's what we're looking for our young people.
You know, in all my years of a therapist, I don't think I can ever recall a client saying, I wish I started having sex earlier. But I saw many, many people who said, I wish I started having sex later. I started too early. I have damage from some of those early sexual experiences. So, you know, I do think it's important to be really honest with our kids about this. And, and to even, you know, that might include self-disclosure, which is uncomfortable with your own children. But, you know, that might involve, you know, them reading stories or watching Peggy's TED Talk. Which I'm like watching it going, I'm showing this to my girls in a few years, you know. But really so that they can start to understand more anecdotal and research-based stuff.
And I think one of the most important things, and it's something I'm really starting to look at, is we're having this conversation, and for the both of us, it's fairly comfortable. And I truly understand and empathize with parents who may be watching, this isn't necessarily, because more than likely when you were younger, just like you said, you didn't have the best experiences. So start small. You know, you don't have to have the whole talk.
Right.
Find those teachable moments, open the door, and, you know, start small and just start to develop the conversation so you become comfortable with it as well. Fake it until you make it. This is
and find resources. Find books you can watch together. There's so many good picture books for the young kids. There's great TED Talks for the older kids. Peggy's is a great one for girls. There's a TED Talk called The Demise of Guys that talks about the effects of pornography on young men. That's really good to watch with your kids. If it's uncomfortable, just put something on. If you are in Orange County, check out the Birds and Bees Connection. They're linked at the top. You guys are doing a summer special.
We're doing this, it's our 15th year, and so we are running in July and August. We rolled everything back, all our prices back to 2002.
Oh, that's awesome.
So you can go on our website, birdsandbeesconnection.com, and you can see our classes. We also have digital classes if you're not in the area as well. So, you know, as you said, there's all kinds of resources. So yes, I think beforehand, outsource.
Do it yourself.
That's right, and that's why we're here. One of the reasons we're here, and please ask questions, and I'm doing my best definitely to answer them, is that we want to help you not just talk about the issues, but also give you tools to be able to deal with these topics, because I think both of us understand it's not an easy topic necessarily to talk about.
Is there anything else we want to cover for these teen years?
Well, I think we've sort of this is sort of a weaving, and I think I want to go back a little bit to the tween years, and we've sort of talked about that 15-year-old who may come to you, and we want that 15-year-old to come. We do.
That's the problem. We
do. They want them to come to you, and, you know, oftentimes they look at you like, no, not coming to you. So that's why we sort of started way back when with these conversations. And the next piece we wanted to talk about was the tween years. And oftentimes parents sort of go into denial. Oh my God, my child is now a tween and puberty is starting to happen. So, you know, I'll talk a little bit about puberty, might talk a little bit about periods. I don't think I'm ready to talk about the birds and bees. In reality, they need to have that conversation.
Right.
And just as much as you talk about periods, which are important, because oftentimes I'll talk to a 14-year-old girl and she still doesn't know that much about her period. So I think those kind of topics are important, but I think now is a really good time to open the door about having the talk. And I understand it may be a challenge. I think it's an important conversation. And again, find those resources of what to say, and start really simple. Ask them what they know.
That's a great question.
You know, what do you know about, you know, and you know what? First of all, have some dessert. You know, make it easy. Take them out for, you know, have a dessert with them, have fun. Even have some humor around it. They call it the birds and bees, where babies don't come from. You know, remember the stork movie? So try to make it as easy as possible. You know, we sort of gird and get really uncomfortable with it, and they pick up on everything. And
one of the things that my kids, I'll ask them often is, what are your friends saying about sex? What are you guys talking about? And I'm like, you can tell me anything. You know, I don't care, but I'm just curious to hear what your friends are saying about sex. And I mean, most of my kids will tell me, and I think it's hilarious, and we laugh, and I correct, or I say that part's true, that part's not true. But, you know, I think it's really fascinating, and they know that they're not going to get in trouble with me because they had a talk about sex with another kid, you know.
And I think there is that, they've heard things, and I think they really do want to talk with you, and that's the interesting part. It's the challenge, and don't be afraid of the eyes rolling or the "oh mom" kind of thing. It's written in the handbook. This is the way I have to respond.
They're obligated to respond,
right? Or they sort to zone out. It's okay. And I love that idea about the third person. Don't make it personal. You know, what are your friends saying? What did you hear or see anything on the internet? You know, sort of question. It's sort of that questioning part.
Yeah.
And open the door. And if you even hear a little bit, here's something to add to it. Oftentimes we'll ask a question and we expect immediate response. You don't always get one. Sometimes you just have to sit there for a while in that, and that silence, you'd be amazed of what comes up. And again, don't make it long. Just find out a little bit and then say, yeah, thank you. I really appreciate your input. This is what I wanted. It helps me as a parent. And I think that's also important, is it's not all about you. It's not all, it's about me as a parent that wants to have this information and curious, and we're there to help you. And I want you to feel comfortable.
One of the ways that I remind myself to have a yearly conversation with my kids about sex is that I talk to my kids about sex every Labor Day. That is just a reminder to me. Labor Day, I mean, obviously that's not the point of Labor Day, but it's a reminder to me that this is my yearly benchmark. So if I haven't said anything for a whole year,
right?
Because I personally really believe that the sex talk should happen at least once a year.
At least.
Right, at least, if it's not an ongoing conversation. So that is just my kick in the pants of like, it's Labor Day. Did I say, have I said anything in the past few months? If I can't remember a conversation in the last few months, I'm going to have one with them around Labor Day.
Right.
It's just, again, just a yearly benchmark to remind myself to have an at least annual conversation.
Right. And I love the idea of first, watching one of the TED Talks, taking one of our classes, whatever the case may be, and then finding that time to don't let it go on too long and start the conversation at that point.
Yeah.
Start easy, but start it.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid of it, because it's like going to the doctor, going to the dentist, or any of those things.
You work it up.
It up in your mind, and you think it's awful. And in reality, in most cases, most parents say to me, "Wow, not only was this not too bad, but I found out so much, and I really enjoyed this conversation with my child."
Totally, I agree. All right.
All right.
Well, I think we have...
Everybody take a breath.
I know. I think we thoroughly covered middle and high school, although there's lots more branches that we want to talk about. All right, thanks for joining us. We will be doing this again next week, so keep an eye out for that. And if you have any questions you want us to answer in our next conversation, leave them in the comments.
Absolutely.